Rising inflation has had a detrimental impact on landlords and tenants across the country, and I'm going to tell you why landlords have had to raise their rents. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an interesting topic for you today, and it has to do with inflation. Obviously, all of us have been impacted by the increase in costs, okay? And one of the biggest costs that we've had to deal with is just the cost of maintenance and repairs. It's kind of odd, but you know what? Sometimes when we raise the rents, people need to understand that we're not raising them just because we want to make more money. Yeah, we want to make more money. And yeah, we're going to raise rents in order to make more money. But a lot of the increases also had to do with inflation in general. That means that our costs have increased. Our costs such as our insurance costs, our property taxes, the cost of maintenance and repairs, etc. Okay? So don't expect us to just be able to keep our rent super low. Things are changing throughout the entire country, and we're just as impacted by inflation as the tenants are. So we're going to do the best we can, but there's a limit to what we can do without having to increase our rents, and it's an unfortunate side effect. And when there's people who can't afford those rents, it isn't that we are evil. It isn't that we are trying to purposefully punish those people, but we have to raise our rents in order to be able to pay for these increased business expenses. So before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button, maybe leave a comment down below and let me know what is the biggest impact in inflation, which cost of yours is the biggest, has inflation made the biggest impact on. So, I know for a fact that the biggest thing for me is, my insurance costs. My insurance costs have skyrocketed in the last couple of years. I mean, they've just gone up so much. Now, obviously, I still am making a profit. I'm still able to work the insurance costs, the increased costs into my numbers and make it work. But that's not the only thing that I've been hit by. So yeah, I'm just curious what the other landlords are going through right now. So anyway, let's get into this article because, this article kind of goes on a, what's going on in a certain part of the country. But remember, this is going on all over the place. Landlords throughout the entire country are feeling the impacts of inflation and, we're suffering. So let's get into the article. This article is coming from northwestmissourinews.com, and it says, landlords talk on inflation prices increasing rent across the community. All right, let's get into it. Rent across the country has continued to soar over the last 5 years, with Missouri rentals increasing over 8% from 2021 to 2022. Maryville is no exception to this. For those renting in town, many rentals have raised prices across the board due to increasing prices of utilities, property taxes, and overall cost of living. Southview Apartments in Maryville is a low-income housing tax credit property unit that bases rental prices off the median income in the community. Southview Apartments property manager Christina Villegas said there was an increase for all the units based on new rates. So they have a low-income housing tax credit, and they have to base it upon the incomes in that community, right? So if there was an increase in what they are able to charge, that means that the amount of money that tenants are making on average in the community has actually increased. So yeah, when you hear a lot of stories about, hey, landlords are raising rent, the impression is always made that, hey, well, tenants are getting zero pay raises, they don't have any increase in income, and then the landlords are raising rent on them. Well, in this situation, that isn't the case, okay? So you have a landlord who's raising rents, and they're able to raise rents because the incomes in the community have gone up. So yeah. Even with the little boost that they get for the cost of living, I don't really feel it helps them a whole lot, Villegas said. I mean, rent goes up when cost of living goes up as well. And so basically, when anything they get goes up, it's not paying for it. You know what I mean? These apartments include water, trash, and sewer in rent, but with the rising rates of everything across the board, sometimes people aren't able to come up with the money to pay rent on top of all the other costs. So yeah, the cost of everything has increased. So the cost of all the utilities. I think they said that the rent includes all these utilities. So yeah, I mean, when the water cost goes up, guess what? We need to be able to charge more rent so that we can cover that cost. So yeah, I mean, I understand where these landlords are coming from, but remember, these tenants are suffering as well. I'm not always, 100% against tenants. I understand that suddenly getting a big price increase on how much you're paying for housing is not easy to swallow, okay? But you have to keep in mind that, like I said, you're not going to be able, if you're not able to find a place cheaper for rent anywhere else in town, that tells you that either your place has, where your landlord is subsidizing your rent for whatever reason they want to, doesn't mean that, the next landlord has to do the same, or that landlord has to continue to do that on into eternity, okay? If the landlord suddenly decides to change and start charging market rate rents, well, it's going to be dependent on you to be able to just, afford it. It's not going to be dependent on the landlord to make sure that you're able to live cheaply. That's part of my gripe with a lot of these tenant advocates. They seem to think in their mind that it is the landlord's responsibility to make sure that these people have somewhere cheap to live. It isn't. It never has been. It never will be. It is upon that person, that individual, to find housing that they can afford. That's it. If you can't afford a 2-bedroom, 1-bath in this part of town, well, you might have to move to another part of town. If you can't afford a 2-bedroom and 1-bath in that part of town, you might have to go down to a 1-bedroom. If you can't afford the 1-bedroom, you might have to go to a studio. If you can't afford the studio, you might have to get a roommate. Okay? I mean, this is the facts and reality of living in the world where, you know what? You have to take care of yourself. You cannot depend upon the government. You can't expect other people to take care of you. You have to take care of yourself. So, these tenants, I feel for them in one way, but on the other hand, it's like, well, you know what? You figure it out. Don't force us as landlords to try to solve your problem for you. I mean, I have some of my residents live paycheck to paycheck, Villegas said. We're a family property and we're trying to help them the best that we can, and not just the rent rate, but everything else. The grocery cost of everything has gone up, and so the struggle has been real for quite a few of us. It comes with sometimes they are late on their rent. President of Stagner Rental Properties, Todd Stagner, has been in the real estate for 20 years and has only seen price increases like this in the last 2 years. He said some of the biggest impacts on rent increase is utilities and property tax. It's the past 2 years because our property taxes and or insurance have all gone up, as well as utilities. If the landlord pays the utilities, I'm not quite sure the actual property tax rate increase, but insurance has gone up, depending on the property, 10 to 12%, he said. Yeah, and I've seen the same. My insurance has increased probably by 10 to 12% as well. Okay, so this landlord is saying the exact same thing that I'm saying, the same thing that I keep hearing from other landlords as well, that, hey, our costs are going up. And like he said, it has been within the last 2 years, and it's obviously been caused by they flooded the market full of cash right after the pandemic began. And that, I mean, what do they expect? Okay, you start printing money, the government starts printing money, it's going to cause inflation. It's obvious. I mean, it was an obvious thing that was going to happen. I remember when they did it, I called it, okay? I called it. I'm going to have to go back and look at my old videos, but I called it years ago when they started this nonsense and said, hey, this is going to cause a heck of a lot of inflation, right? And so I looked up inflation and I looked up at the side effects of inflation, and I realized that, okay, if inflation happens, these interest rates, the only way that they can bring inflation back down is by increasing interest rates, right? So I went out and I refinanced all my properties while interest rates were low. So if you're talking about, a ways to minimize the impact of inflation and increasing interest rates, et cetera, for landlords, having a nice fixed rate, interest rate on your properties, it's great. Okay. It's absolutely great. Now I own a lot of smaller properties. I don't own a big commercial multifamily, so I was able to get 30-year fixed rate on the majority of them. I do have some commercial loans with balloon that ends in 5 years, but that's only for two of my properties. So you know what? The best thing, if you want to minimize the impacts of inflation, is to make sure you have that fixed rate mortgage if you're a single family landlord or a small mom and pop landlord, okay? So let me continue here. Hirsch's Rentals owner, Alan Hirsch, has been in the business for over 20 years and owns many properties on 4th Street. He said he hasn't seen something like this before the last couple of years, and he thinks the rising costs come from a trickle-down effect that starts with delivering products but ends with the consumers having to pay the price. As he does his own maintenance on his properties, he said everything, down to small parts, have doubled in price over recent years. We go in there to repair stuff that I used to pay or used to buy for $5, like a toilet float. Now it's 14, he said. It's ridiculous. Yeah, and a lot of the supply chain issues that we had during the pandemic, that also contributed to a lot of the inflation. So we had supply chain issues going on. We had the government printing money. We had just, it's a huge problem. Inflation is way up. Simple parts, and I've seen this as well, simple parts are a lot more expensive. What you have to pay your maintenance men or repair men to do service in your place is a lot more. Everything is more. So don't expect us to keep our rents low. We're raising our rents. We're trying to minimize the impact of this inflation as much as possible, but there's only so much we can do. So yeah, interesting article. We'll see what happens going into the future. It looks right now like maybe the Federal Reserve Bank will slow down or stop the increases in the interest rate, and that might stop the increases in interest rates for mortgages and loans as well. Hopefully inflation is slowing down or stopping, because we need to stop it. It's just making running our businesses more difficult.